Hello everyone, welcome back to Munro Live. Today we're going to be looking at the Yoke from the Tesla Model S Plaid, and with me today are Tylor and Carl. Tylor did a lot of the behind the scenes work on the first 100 or so videos. He did a lot of the editing, a lot of the grunt work that we've got Eric to do now. So he's here now on this side of the camera, going to help us through the steering system from this vehicle. We have a couple of the old Tesla steering wheels here as well that we're going to be comparing to. We have the Model Y from a 2020 Model Y and a 2017 Model 3. We also brought out the Mach-E as well, just to give you guys a little bit more comparison of what's out there. And with that, I'm going to let you guys go ahead and take a look at what we have.
Yeah, well, I think we should start with the idea of steering wheels. I think like back in the 50s and 60s, steering wheels used to be pretty cool. And I'd say for the last 30 years, steering wheels have been kind of an afterthought. So it's nice to see an OEM like Tesla out there going to stir the pot again and kind of create, have the focus be on a steering wheel, right? Change the game up a little bit. Pardon my exaggeration, but like a steering wheel really is like a symphony of a lot of different systems together. You have upholstery wrapping, you have polymers, injection molded, reaction injection molded, you have metal castings, you have electronics that are inside, you have linkages that are inside, you have a pyrotechnic airbag that is probably the most important part, saving lives all the time. And all that has to be 2 feet in front of a driver's face, and you can't tell that any of that's going on. So it's got to be designed beautifully. And so it's nice to see the circle kind of get tested a little bit. And so I don't know, I've never drove the Model S. I know you did, Sandy did, Corey did. What's your opinion on the usability of it? I
took about an hour round trip with it, and pulling out of the driveway to start with in the parking lot was a little bit different because there was nothing up top to grab onto. But as I was driving down the road, there was no real difference at all. When I got to my destination, it wasn't that bad to pull into a parking spot. I adapted pretty quickly to it. And then when I left and came back here, the driving part of it, I barely noticed that it was different. What I did have a little bit of an issue with was the horn. They've moved their horn location from behind the driver's airbag to a button with your thumb. The one time that I needed to honk my horn because somebody was merging into my lane, I hit the airbag and didn't do anything. So it's not it's a reactionary thing to hit the airbag for the horn.
There was something in the user manual apparently where you could cover up your whole hand on all those capacitive sensors and activate the horn.
You very well could, but again,
that might be a way to get around it.
I don't know. You're still used to just hitting right in the middle, so that's where instinctively my hand went. When I went to turn the blinkers on, it wasn't that bad to use my thumb. I had to look down a few times to get it, to make sure I was hitting the right button, but not that bad because I'm thinking about it before I turn on my blinker.
Well, I guess we don't need to get too much in the subjective nature of it because I'm sure there's hundreds of videos online of people giving their opinions on it. Today, obviously, we're going to get into how a steering wheel works. And, as Carl mentioned right before the video started, we cracked the Yoke and got into it. But my one comment on that is I honestly really don't care from a subjective standpoint. That's not my job my job is to analyze parts and not necessarily their functionality. And I know humans can adapt to anything. Like when the first smartphones came out and the tiny letters are on the keyboards on the screen, like, oh, this is never going to work. Look at us all now. We've adapted. So I'm sure people can adapt to it. So I also like that Tesla's kind of pushing the FMVSS standards a little bit too, right? Because there's always loopholes in those standards and really what things have to be. And a lot of people thought this was going to be illegal. And I know NHTSA has made some comments on it, but obviously, it's on the road, people are buying it. So anyway, I think we should start from the outside and work our way in. Carl is the upholstery master, the interior guy. So we'll start with the wrapping.
So it's not just the wrapping. Thinking about a steering wheel and thinking about any component in a vehicle, whenever I'm looking at the A surface, I want to know how much A surface I have. Wherever you have a surface hidden, that's where all of your sins can lie and sins can hide. But on any type of a steering wheel, all of this is visible. This is the only area that I have that is not hidden. So you really have to plan these patterns incredibly well so that when you cut, when you sew, when you bring all of this together, everything lands where it needs to be. Now that is a big challenge, and the people who make these patterns, figure out this system, they are artists, and I will give them that credit. When we switched over to the yoke, going from the outside in, we ripped the cover off. All right, how much sewing do I have here? Barely any. Now, whenever you have a steering wheel coming together, you have to have these seams that wrap it all up. Again, 360 degrees. All of these are seam grooves. This is where we will hide and tuck the material. It is possible to have this as a sewn patch, tuck right into that seam groove. But all the rest of this material, there is no sewing. It was actually tucked and pressed in using a solvent-based adhesive by hand. No sewing at all on this one. But if we compare that to the Mach-E, the Mach-E sewing has a machine-applied stitch that goes along each edge, and then you hand sew from stitch to stitch, closing it up. Most steering wheels are closed up that way. I've had customers ask me in the past about trying to do some sort of a tuck seam. You can do it. It is labor intensive, and you have to have very wide seam grooves. I measured this groove, it's about 3.5 millimeters wide, but each side of this material is only about 1 millimeter thick. So you do have a lot of tolerance that thankfully is all hidden behind your hands. So that would go through the cover, but what about the foam, Tyler?
Yeah. So once you get below the leather or the vinyl wrapping, and actually before we get into that, do you want to talk a little bit about whether or not this is leather?
It is not leather.
Yeah, the Model 3 was leather in 2018, then 2020 Model Y went to a vinyl, and you would think, you know, an expensive vehicle like the Model S might go the leather route, but it's not. This is vinyl, correct?
Yeah.
And I guess the argument though is that it's vegan leather, which may be something you've brought up in other videos, but vegan leather is essentially just plastic, right?
It's oil.
Which is made from petroleum, same thing that gas is made from. So us being more interior guys getting into plastics, that is a bit of an irony. That's fun to talk about. We won't get too much into that. So below the wrapping on most steering wheels is almost always going to be polyurethane, and that's made from a reaction injection molding. Now, reaction injection molding is inherently different from regular injection molding in that it's not a thermoplastic process. You don't heat up plastic, melt it, and shove it into a cavity. You mix two chemicals together, a lot like epoxy, right? You mix two chemicals together and they chemical reaction, they harden up. You're mixing polyols and isocyanates. They foam up inside of the tool and create whatever density you want, really. Pardon me, but I'm gonna show two examples here. The range of densities and different styles for polyurethane are quite on each side of the spectrum. Seat foam is made from a polyurethane foam, about as soft as it gets. Most mattresses are made from polyurethane foam, but you can also do a polyurethane hard plastic. This is about as hard as it gets. Both of these are a polyurethane process done from reaction injection molding. The steering wheel is usually somewhere between those two densities. If you grab this material, it definitely feels hard to the touch because there's a skeleton inside, but it's got a little give to it. It's a little bit soft. It's like a dense foam. And that's almost what all steering wheels are going to have over their armature. Armature being the steel, or I should say the metal skeleton on the inside. And what that allows them to do is kind of create these complex shapes that either they can wrap or other plastic pieces can go around. What's nice about reaction injection molding is that unlike injection molding, which you need like a uniform thickness throughout most of the part, you can go from really thick, inch thick, down to really thin, couple millimeters thick, all in the same part. So it's a lot like a metal casting, and you can get really creative with the shapes. And it's, of course, very lightweight and structural at the same time. So that's a little tidbit on reaction injection molding. You got any questions about it, Carl?
Well, we cut apart this one. Is there any difference?
Not from the outside.
Not from the outside.
And we could save that for the end of the video, or we can get into it right now. From the outside, they're basically the same polymer base. in about the same density. But at the end of the video, as we dig down, we'll show how it might be a little bit different.
All right.
So the next thing really below all this stuff is, I guess, the plastics, right? I guess it's not below it, but it's another feature of it. These are just decorative plastics. This is separate from leather wrapping. You're gonna need decorative plastics. And the only thing interesting about these are, this part right here is electroplated. Gives it like a nickel chrome finish. Basically, they're, you probably know more about that. I think you have an electroplating process in your garage. But you're basically a thin layer of nickel metal bonding to the plastic surface. That's basically replacing all chrome on cars these days. Then the only thing unique about this is you can kind of see it's a polycarbonate and it's like a translucent smoky gray. And then they're painting the outside surface. And then if you hold that, I'll grab a light, then they're laser etching all of their logos and whatnot for the capacitive buttons. So if I shine a light through here, you can see they're basically laser etching off the paint. And so that translucent plastic is able to show through light. And then of course, down here you have the airbag logo, which you might be able to see in the video, but you can't shine light through it. So it's barely visible. You know, in the right sunlight, you can see that there's an airbag logo because there's a little chrome that shines through, but it's basically just laser etched and you're kind of seeing the translucent airbag logo. What I like about this is another one of those playing with the FMVSS standards, or I think it's actually the ECE standards.
So we've had this
the European
debate
standards
with several of the OEMs that I've worked with in the past, and all of them say, well, we have to have an airbag logo for an airbag. They're talking about for the driver airbag, they're talking about for the passenger airbag, the seat airbags, side curtain airbags, knee airbags, all these things
in
have
the
to have
location,
logos.
you have to have a logo saying that's where an airbag is.
And that is wrong. All of them, from the tier 1 suppliers through the OEMs that I've worked through, I said, can you find that FMVS requirement? And they couldn't. They had it in their internal documents that it was a requirement. The only thing that I was able to find is in the ECE, which are the European requirements. There is a requirement that you must have an airbag logo within the circumference of the steering wheel. And then there's an airbag warning label that's required on either the sun visor or in the glove box. So for ECE, yes, I have to have an airbag logo there. For FMVSS, all of the other airbags, there is no airbag logo on the top of the IP for passenger. You don't need it, but every time I challenge the OEMs that I've worked with, they say, oh, but it's our internal requirement. And then they never know how to put one on. Well, is it something that's embossable? Does it have to be Plaid printed? Does it have to be embroidered? Does it have to be a plastic button? And they can never come up with an answer.
What I love about this is that Tesla's always pushing the boundary. Like, you could barely notice that, and you don't even know it's there. Like, they met it by ECE standards, but they did it in the most hidden possible way to where it doesn't really affect the design of the car, right? It's not this ugly label in your way. So I think that's all we can really talk about with that plastic. Below that, I guess you can get into the airbags real quick if you want to take over with talking about the differences in the airbags.
So we have some airbags that are, of course, wrapped in leather, some airbags that are wrapped in PVC. This one was wrapped in PVC. I ripped up the corner just to see. One thing that I did notice is I do not believe this is the same material that is being used to wrap the steering wheel. There is some sort of a difference in there, which I am not really sure what that difference may be. I know the adhesives are different. This would be a roll coat hot melt adhesive. This is a solvent-based adhesive. They do have the Tesla embossing, but this embossing has a corresponding divot in the plastic itself, so it's kind of holding itself down when it's glued in. I did not rip this back enough to see what they are doing for their airbag scoring. You can clearly see this airbag score line passing through here. Now, there are several different methods of weakening this vinyl for the airbag scoring, whether they're using a rotary knife, whether they're using a laser, whether they're using some other perforation form. I would have to dig into this much further to try and figure that out. But unfortunately, this was not done well enough so that you have an invisible airbag, which we prefer.
One thing that I did find interesting about that is, this is something I wasn't aware of, but I started seeing on the internet recently. Not having, you know, one of those nickel-plated, chromed, fancy logos like a lot of them have in the center, and even, of course, the Model Y and Model 3. Prevents, I guess, what people have been calling as branding. During accidents, if your arms are in just the right spot, you get an OEM logo, like an Audi logo or a Hyundai logo or a Tesla logo in your arm. So that's not going to happen likely with this one. Google it, look it on the internet. It's a thing apparently. Yeah, so, the only other thing I think we noticed about the airbags is
the attachment method.
Yeah, the
and then also that horn and why the attachment's difference between the horns.
Oh, yes,
Let me switch sides for you.
Of course. So getting into the attachment method, normally there's basically a little spring latch mechanism where in the cast alloy there you can see there's basically spots to receive these 3 steel rods that'll actually catch and lock that airbag into place. But because this has a typical horn, you also need these spring mechanisms sitting right above that, and that allows you to push that horn in, and metal contacts metal, closes a circuit, activates the horn. That, as we mentioned in the beginning of the video, doesn't exist on the Tesla Model S. This is a fixed, locked-in airbag, and it actually only uses 2 little metal posts there instead of 3 locking it into place. Although I did find it interesting that they used a whole separate injection molded assembly.
2 of them?
2 of them on each side, I believe, like that, to catch that, where they've done it before and many other OEMs do it, but why couldn't they just keep that integration in the casting? It's like a whole extra part to do essentially the same function. Really the only difference is this is locked into place and it doesn't push in at all because your horn is a capacitive button. Other than that, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty, is the electrical connectors. Big major difference between, I shouldn't say major, this is really minuscule, but when it comes to wire harnesses, the most expensive part of wire harnesses are the connectors themselves. You can see on the Model 3 and Model Y, they're much more complex connectors that are actually removable. This little red tab lets you unlock it and take them off. If the airbag goes off, this has to be replaced anyway with the unit. So this is made of 1, 2, 3 blue, yellow, red pieces of plastic, and they're removable. On the Model S, this is a much cheaper one-piece plastic. It's actually a living hinge. So that's molded in one spot and then it folds over, kind of creates its housing there, and it's just got locking features that are like integrated one and done. So basically when you shove this thing in, it's an audible click. You hear the click, you know it's in, and the only way to get that out is to basically break the plastic, which we did. It bends the flaps out. So once these are installed, there's no way to pull them out, which is kind of a good idea for a safety feature, right? Like you don't want to, like, if you have to replace this harness anyway, if you get in an accident and the deployment goes off, why did these need to be expensive removable connectors? 3 pieces of plastic versus 1 piece of plastic and less assembly. I'm not an electrical guy, so I might be getting some of that wrong, but that is a cost savings on the Model S for sure.
So they have a lot of integration, and some of this integration goes back into the steering column. So I think maybe we should jump over to there and mention how this is mounting up, and then we can come back to its core structure.
For sure. Ben, do you want to hop in maybe on the steering columns? You're a little bit more knowledgeable about those.
These are the 2 steering columns. This one is from the Model Y that we took down, and this is the Model S that we've recently torn down. You can see they are the same steering column. So from this clock spring down, all of the parts are the same. We have a few brackets that are still mounted on this Model Y that we've taken off of the Model S, but everything is exactly the same and it would carry over. So Tesla's able to get the huge volumes that they're getting out of their Y and their 3 for their steering column, and saving the costs and just buying a few more for the Model S.
So this is a more expensive vehicle using the same components as a less expensive vehicle. And they have the benefit of, I no longer need that component. They can just throw it out. You still have the hole here, but it's less expensive in a cost, but yet on a more expensive vehicle.
Exactly, and you can pull both sides out of them, and what they're doing is they're moving that functionality, like we said, to the steering wheel. So to these 2 thumb button modules that we have here. You can't see, but this is where the capacitive touch would be shining through. This would come in through the back here. You have the same wheel that you had on the 3 and the Y. They just added some capacitive touch buttons. So it did add a little bit of complexity and cost to this part, but not nearly as much as they saved by getting rid of the stalks that they took off of both sides.
Yeah, for Model 3 and Y, the space and a component very similar to that already existed. So they're just merging with the Model S Plaid some of those functions.
So, and something else that they were able to do here is, could you pull off the plastic from the Y is the module? Oh, the back side of this guy. The module that they have that was in the Y and the 3 for the steering wheel, they've been able to incorporate that elsewhere in the vehicle. So they have this module that is now no longer here. So again, saving some weight and then saving some costs from having to build another separate module. And this would control the heated steering wheel that was an option on this vehicle. So they've commonized all of these parts between the Model Y and the Model S and then removed from their steering column. And what we're seeing that Tesla's going to be doing coming forward, possibly in the Cybertruck, is going to a steer-by-wire system, which would take, and they would keep this clock spring and the rest of this column, they're going to throw away. They wouldn't need it. The steering or the clock spring would need to get a little bit more complicated. They'll be putting a motor in here for some feedback. But what steer-by-wire is think of it as a video game controller. Your steering wheel is going to go to a sensor that's in your clock spring that's going to go down to the motor that's on the steering rack and adjust your steering back and forth. So what they can do is, I've got a tweet from Elon here. I'm just going to read it because it's easier than trying to remember it. But variable gain, steer-by-wire, yoke would be ideal. So what he is saying there is they want to go to steer-by-wire, and variable gain means if I'm going slow and I turn the wheel 90 degrees, it's going to turn the wheels that are on the ground as sharp as they will go. So I wouldn't ever need to turn the wheel 180, 360 degrees. So a lot of those issues that people are having in parking lots with the yoke, that goes away when you go to steer-by-wire, because you only need to go 90 degrees or 75 degrees, or 90 degrees or 115 degrees to be able to pull into your parking spot or pull out of a parking spot. And then as you're going down the road at higher speeds, it changes and it goes back to what you're typically used to driving with. So that is a huge cost savings because they already have the steering rack with the motor on it for their autopilot system. You're already not having any manual input and the car is turning back and forth and steering itself. So they can get rid of this rack, get rid of this steering column, utilize their steering rack with the motor, and save
amount of weight.
There's about 10 kilograms here of weight that they could save, and it's going to be about a $75 cost savings to be able to get rid of all of these components and have it just be steer-by-wire.
Play with the FMVSS standards and what is legal, what's not legal. Those are always being tested in the automotive market, and I love to see new innovations like that. It's basically no more mechanical connection between your steering wheel and your steering rack. Just like there's no more mechanical connection between your most accelerator throttles anymore and stuff like that. So cool. I guess we can kind of get into the final finale here of cutting this thing open and seeing what we found out. So as you can see, a lot of these steering wheels have already been cut open. We like to see what the armature looks like and kind of the interior design.
So from our Mach-E,
Yep.
we've cut it open.
Yep.
We can see the metallic core. We can see the polyurethane foam. We can see a heat mat, which is heating wires embedded into a foam. And then we have the leather covering over top of that. So these are the traditional layers that we would normally see.
And that heat wrap's not unlike the way your seat's being heated, right? It's just a pad with electronic resistance, right, for your copper wires, producing heat. So this is a heated steering wheel. What we thought was interesting from the get-go about this is there is no wire pad wrapped on the outside. And we see the wire going in, so we're like, oh man, are they embedding the wires? We don't see that very often. So of course we had to cut it open and see what the deal is. And we found more than we expected, actually. So if you get close, you can actually see the copper wire wrapping. So it is molded in there. I'll let you zoom in and get a good view. But what we saw is a second layer of what's likely polyurethane foam. So this not only goes through one rim molding process, but two. And then on top of that, it looks like there's a metal insert in the armature. And when we pulled it apart, we realized that it's not continuous, but they're segmented steel bars in there. So we've come up with about 3 hypotheses, none of which we're claiming are correct, and some of them are off the wall, but we'll go into them right now. So there's the black outer polyurethane, the white inner likely polyurethane, and then the steel bar. So the way they're molding this is you have to have your cast alloy in first, then they insert steel rods, then they overmold the white polyurethane, then they put the copper heat scrim in there, and then they do their final molding over top. Now that
Very complicated.
It's very complicated assembly, and it's actually probably driving costs into this. Having half the material, you'd think this would be a cheaper steering wheel, but this is adding cost, and I almost imagine it would be a wash in cost at the end because you're doing 2 or 3 extra steps that you normally wouldn't do. But why are they doing it? First guess is that white polyurethane layer in the middle is an insulator, and it's stopping heat from these copper wires from going downward and soaking into the metal structure, meaning it's likely more efficient. All your heat goes to your hands out here, and maybe that requires less electricity in order to heat the same type of steering wheel. That's probably the most likely. But why are the steel rods in there? You do not see steel rods. Well, here's another off-the-wall one. When we bandsawed this piece and held this in our hands, of course, the bandsaw heated up the metal, but this stayed warm to the touch for like 10 minutes afterwards. It held heat for a while. So there was an off-the-wall theory that maybe that middle layer is thermally conductive, and it's able to soak that heat and store it in a steel bar. Now I know what I'm saying sounds crazy talk, but you could cycle the steering wheel heater on, let it collect the heat, and turn the steering wheel heater off, and you'd just be holding the steering wheel, and the user doesn't know that electricity is not being used anymore, and the heat's just stored in that rod. Now that's probably not what's happening, but it's a nice theory. The third and final theory is that the first theory applies that it is an insulator, and that steel is just there for either structural strength or extra weight to make a nice heavy steering wheel so it's not too light. What are your thoughts on that?
Because it's segmented, I can't see any other reasoning behind that. It can't be for structural strength if it's segmented. So I would think that it must be for weight. And then the question is, well, what type of weight? Is it weight just so that you feel the weight in your hand? Well, that doesn't really make sense because I'm not holding the weight of my steering wheel. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe that is in preparation for steer-by-wire. Right now, your steering column kind of counteracts your force when you're steering your car. Sometimes you can just let go of the wheel and it goes back to home.
Because there's a mechanical linkage between your chassis and your steering wheel, so it kind of naturally wants to steer.
So if this is now going to steer-by-wire and you're going to have a motor or a spring, having a weighted lower steering wheel, possibly that is helping it find its own center position. That may be completely made up, pulling it out of nowhere, but I just don't understand why the steel is segmented.
Without talking to Tesla directly, I guess all it is conjecture at this point, but that's why I love this type of job, because we get to try and figure out why people make the products they do. Now, we'll end with a bang here. We keep talking about adding steel to add weight. Why would you need to add weight? Well, we need to add weight because this is about the lightest alloy you can use. The Ford Mach-E uses the same type of alloy, and that's magnesium. Tesla Model Y and Model 3 use aluminum mainly. I believe it's got like 2% magnesium in it, but this is mainly magnesium with a couple percentage of aluminum in it, and of course other elements as well, but mainly magnesium. Now, how are we able to tell that? Well, we do have an XRF scanner, which you could put on there, and not everyone has that though. So there's a couple little tips and tricks you could actually use at home to find out whether or not something's aluminum or magnesium. Sometimes they'll just tell you, which is really nice, but when you pull out a magnet and touch these, they're not ferrous, so you're not going to get anywhere. So one little trick you can use at home to figure out whether or not something is magnesium or aluminum alloy is magnesium will react to acids. So this is just a bottle of white vinegar. You could use CLR, any really acidic liquid. And this is going to be tough to get on camera, so we might have to do this separately. But if you drop a couple drops on there, you get close, you'll see it bubbles and fizzes, not unlike like a pop carbonation. And if I did the same thing to aluminum alloy, you will not see the same type of bubbling reaction if you get up close to it. So that's a telltale sign that something is cast magnesium and not cast aluminum. That's the boring way. So the more fun way
Magnesium
is magnesium has a flammability to it that aluminum does not. And so I took the liberty to shave some of this metal off of the magnesium alloy and get it into a nice little pile here. And if you took a lighter, this is a nice way to tell if it's magnesium or not. Magnesium will basically light on fire. So there's your other way to tell. Anything else, guys?
Nope, I think that's it for today. Thanks everybody for joining us, going through the Yoke and comparing some steering systems from the previous generations of Tesla to the Model S. Thank you, Tylor and Carl, for going through everything with us. And wanted to thank SABIC again for their sponsorship of the road trip. And thanks to everybody at home that has purchased a rotor laminate. We really appreciate that. And thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time.